Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Hey, everybody, we're back with more live from the Heartland for the week of July 8th. I'm really excited and happy to have one of my best friends on the show today, the one and only Rus Bradburd. We are recording this on the 4th of July in the year of 2023. And I'm in Chicago and Rus is in, I think, Belfast. And, it was only 3 weeks ago that Rus dropped me off at a hotel in El Paso. We had just finished the 31st year of basketball in the barrio. And I knew he was heading to Ireland and he's over there. What are you doing over there, Rus?
Well, I was over here. I've lived over here a couple of times, but I'm in Northern Ireland working on a book project. It's a funny, unusual story. Not funny, but an unusual story. There's been an influx of Syrian refugees in particular, but also Sudanese and Ukrainians. And the Northern Ireland is just 4% of the UK's population, but they get 21% of the refugees. And so the town has changed quite a bit because of the refugees in totally good ways, to my eye. But many of the children of these refugees, the parents want something for them to do, get them involved in any games or sports. And so they're sticking them into Gaelic football. And the sort of the cousin of Gaelic football is a sport called hurling, which is somewhat like lacrosse, somewhere between lacrosse and soccer and rugby, but it's played with sticks. And Gaelic football is sort of a cross between soccer and rugby. They're both speed games, but they're traditional Irish sports. And so it just seemed like an unusual story to me that these children, just the way parents in America might have if they came over from Germany in the 1950s or wherever, you stick the kids into Little League baseball or Pop Warner football or whatever it is to assimilate the kids. And so it's an interesting phenomenon here, and it's largely because the refugees have this terrible violence behind them, but the Belfast has this terrible violence behind from the trouble, what everyone calls the Troubles, that mostly ended when the Good Friday Agreement came in 1998. So it's just it was surprising to me that people would go to Belfast looking for a peaceful way of life. At one time that would have seemed absurd, but now it seems to be working out, and it's through sport. As you well know, the sport is often the bridge to bringing cultures together.
Well, let me give folks a little background. I used to own a place that many of the listeners or viewers to the show know, the Heartland Cafe. And I don't know, I imagine you were a customer there. I know you had gone to Northport Park College, and you were a recruiter for basketball teams. You ended up working with Haskins and Henson, two legendary coaches. Your brother lived with an old friend of ours, Bob Rudnick. And at one point, you invited me to go to basketball in the barrio in El Paso. And I've been going there now ever since 2001 or so. My wife, Paige, and I did come and visit you in 2005 in Tralee when you were coaching a professional team, the Tralee Tigers, which went on to win the basketball championship, the pro basketball championship in Ireland. But you were also working on your first book, which was Paddy on the Hardwood, which was kind of a memoir of you coaching and learning the violin. And so with all that said, one thing I noticed in Tralee was the number of non-Irish white people. Just back then in 2005, there were a lot of Africans there, other folks. I was kind of impressed with that. And I'm going to ask you, why is it, do you think that Ireland has 21% of the refugees who are coming and the rest of Great Britain has only a small percentage?
Yeah, well, at that time I was in the Republic of Ireland, and there was a huge influx right as I was leaving. It was actually 2004, but right when I was leaving, or the year I was leaving, there was a big influx of Polish immigrants because they were part of the European Union, and that gave them the right. There's much more work in Ireland than there was in Poland, I guess. But I'm in Northern Ireland now, and I do think that Northern Ireland is sort of always been seen with disdain by Great Britain and by the English. is they don't have any great love or affection for Northern Ireland, and I think it's cost them a lot of money and a lot of heartache and a lot of problems, but they can't quite seem to let Northern Ireland go. And some people and of course there's a loyalist side of people here. About half the people in Northern Ireland desperately want to stay as part of the United Kingdom, and they're called loyalists here. And the other side are nationalists, people that want a national unity on the island of Ireland. But I think the refugees are getting dumped. We do this in the United States, of course, where we dump nuclear waste. It's often the poorest of the poor that get things dumped on them. And I think in this case, or think about when Boston was first thinking about desegregating in the 1970s, it was the poorest areas that they said, well, we'll put the kids from South Boston in with the poorest kids from Roxbury or wherever it was. I don't know Boston very well, but it's often the poor people that bear the brunt of it. And what they've done here is they're putting refugees into the middle class, working class neighborhoods. But they have a few interesting things that they're doing that I think is really smart. One is they give them free housing. Another is they give them a small stipend. But there is no Syrian neighborhood in Belfast, even though there's a strong Syrian community now. I think there's 700 or 800 Syrians here now, but there is no Syrian neighborhood. And you might remember this, Mike, from our time together in El Paso. El Paso, I think, whatever the percentage of African American was in El Paso, it's a town of 700,000 with something like 40,000 African Americans in El Paso, and there's no black neighborhood. And there's never really been a black neighborhood in El Paso, or not for the last 70 or 80 years. And there's good and bad that comes out of that. But one way is, I think, because there's not a Syrian there's a Syrian community, but there's not a Syrian neighborhood, if that makes sense. So I think they get together on the weekends and that kind of thing. And one thing it does is it forces you to sort of, we've got to all get along here and figure out how to live together. And it's through sport, I think, that in my view, that it's happening in spades here in Belfast.
Russ, who are the Syrians who are coming? I mean, are they all people who've been driven out of their land? Are they more middle class in Syria who could still get out?
Yeah, it's the ones who can. It's the ones who can afford it, and that's a really good question, because it surprised me as I was talking to. I was actually, they're often, they have whispered to me and said, that Belfast is a perfectly nice town, perfectly safe, but they've whispered to me and said our house was much bigger than this in Syria, and when I was interviewing a woman from Sudan, and I just sort of I must have said something that gave her the message that I was making some assumptions about how she'd clawed her way out of poverty to come here. She said, well, I was training to be a lawyer back in Sudan, and a young woman. And so I think in our part of the world, near the border of El Paso, we often have the idea that it's often the poorest of the poor that are leaving Venezuela or Guatemala or Mexico. They're starving to death on their farms, and they'll do anything to get over. And I do think there's an element of truth to that, but that's not the case here. It's asylum seekers that can point to, and so in Syria, it's people fleeing the Assad regime and fleeing the violences. And it's for the ones I've met, the only ones I've met have all been Sunni Muslims. And of course, Assad is not a Sunni, he's Alawite. So I'm learning quite a bit about Syria, quite a bit about Ukraine, and quite a bit about Sudan, and there's even one Nigerian who's at the center, really an important Nigerian story that's at the center of the book. It's a book project.
So we want to talk about the book project, but let me just go back to who are the refugees. And I'm going back to El Paso, because I would bet that, the people seeking asylum, and we've all seen lots of pictures and news articles. I would bet that they had better means than a lot of poor people, let's just say. But you had a situation where you had an encounter with a family from Venezuela. How does that fit into all your stuff right now?
Well, that one surprised me as well. Is that it was right before I came back here, Mike. I think the key to all of it is, I'm going to hold it up here for your listeners, aren't going to be able to tell, but your viewers will. This is an iPhone. And if you don't know if you're not savvy on the phone, and I'm not great at it, remember with COVID, and there were all these things you had to do to get your COVID in order to travel, you had to get this on, you had to download this and upload this. And that if you're not fluent and well to do enough to own an iPhone and know how to use it, like if you don't know how technology works, you're screwed. And that's true with everyone, but with the United States and United Kingdom. But I think I was sitting on my porch one day, which overlooks a tiny park, as you know, and there was a family sitting there, and I was just just not doing much, just sitting on the porch having a beer, and I thought, geez, it's getting dark and they haven't moved for over an hour. And it dawned on me with all the people coming across the border in El Paso, which is just 40 miles away. So I went over and asked them, and they were Venezuelans and they were asylum seekers and they had their papers, and yes, we're going to sleep in the park tonight. Well, it's always very nice in the park by our house, especially this time of year. It's not too hot. The mosquitoes aren't out yet, but the sprinklers come on at 11 every night. And I mean, they drenches the park. And I knew what was going to happen. They were going to get washed. So we stuck them in our little tiny guest house that you've stayed in, of course. And they wanted we wanted them to stay, but they have a court date in New York in February, and they wanted to go to New York City. And I think it's probably a little bit like your first time in Europe. Where did you go your first time in Europe, Mike?
My first time in Europe was to visit you in Tralee. And my first encounter was a forced march. We got off the plane, we were exhausted, and you took us on about a 10-mile hike.
Yes, and it was just so you'd sleep well that night. But most people, when they go over and think, well, I want to see Paris and I want to go to London, and no one is saying, no one goes thinking, I want to go, no one thinks of going to these smaller towns like Las Cruces, New Mexico. But our feeling was they could find a home in Las Cruces. They could send their kids to bilingual school, and he could find work, and we were shocked and disappointed. We gave him as much hospitality as we could, and the whole neighborhood was involved. But they wanted to go to New York, and the neighborhood all got together, and we all chipped in and flew them off to New York. And right away from day one, day two, maybe day two, it's like, I have to use Google Translate because my Spanish isn't great. It's better than most, but the Venezuelan Spanish, of course, is slightly different. But, I'm getting texts that says, there's nowhere for us to stay. It's overcrowded. We left the shelter. There's nowhere to eat. Do you know of anyone? I said, wrote back, said, I don't know of any jobs in New York. I know people in New Mexico. Now, if it was Chicago, maybe I could have helped. So we worry about them. They had 3 beautiful children, but they have it in their head, and they have a court date now. But my understanding, of course, is that most of the asylum seekers, they get denied asylum, and you're back off you're going to either get shipped back or you're going to go live underground.
You also said to me when this was first happening that people couldn't work. They get released, they're on their own, but they are not allowed to work. Whereas you're telling me that what Great Britain has in Northern Ireland for refugees from a number of countries is they not only give them a place to stay, give them a small stipend, and they probably would allow them to work too, right?
Well, they give the adults get the equivalent, and I might get some of the facts wrong here, so my apologies to your listeners. That there's probably a lot of people out there who know more about this than I do. But
sure.
They get about the equivalent of $40 each per week per adult. But if they're asylum seekers, what any asylum seeker wants in Belfast is to become a refugee, to have refugee status. Asylum seeker is the first step, and then if you get refugee status, and the next step would be citizenship. But some of the Syrians, there's a Syrian resettlement plan, and some of the Syrians are coming over, and they were able to skip a step, and they are able to work right away if they can. But the language is an issue, and so there's an awful lot of teaching English to refugees now or to asylum seekers now that happens all the time. But the danger, of course, Michael, is imagine if you left the United States and you're a restaurant owner and a photographer and an actor. But that doesn't mean if you go to Syria that you're going to get to be a restaurant owner, a photographer, and an actor. You might be driving Uber, or you could be washing dishes. So virtually, I would imagine that most of them are not coming over as highly skilled labor, and if they are, they're not going to get to do. They're not going to live their dream and do their life's work. They're just fleeing a war.
Russ, I'm going to want our listeners, our viewers, to know that you are an author with a number of really great books. I mentioned Patty on the Hardwood. You did a book on Nolan Richards, The 40 Minutes of Hell, which is a great, biography and a lesson in race for a lot of people. Your most recent book is All the Dreams We Dreamed, about basketball and people getting killed on the west side here in Chicago, focusing on our friend Sean Harrington. Talk a little bit about your newest project, because I know it's you've been deep into it for a while. You're over back and forth to Ireland, to Las Cruces, and a little bit of Chicago. What are you doing over there now? How many people have you talked to, and what are some great things to share with us?
Well, one of the things about All the Dreams We've Dreamed, looking at the gun violence in the world of Chicago basketball, it was a dark and depressing book. And so one of the first writer I ever met was the great John Conroy, who uncovered the police torture stories that first ran in the Chicago Reader, but and helped end the death penalty in Illinois. And Conroy's a real hero to me. I know he is to you too. But I used to think, how can Conroy do this? Like, it's just, he walks down, metaphorically and literally walks down such dark alleys, and so the All the Dreams We Dreamed was to me, it was a really sad and depressing book, because I don't see any end to the violence in Chicago, although Sean Harrington, as you know, is much more optimistic than I am. But what I'm working on now, what I'm doing now, is going around interviewing the refugee families, usually the parents, because the kids, don't quite always have the perspective that the parents do. But then also, so there's this terrible violence behind these families, usually in Syria. I'd say 60% of the book project I'm on now is about Syrian refugees, but there's also this terrible violence behind people in Belfast, and nearly everyone has been touched by the violence. Just as if we go to the west side of Chicago, everybody has a story to tell about someone they know who got killed, or their best friend whose friend got killed, or hardly anyone has not been touched by the violence. And it's the same in Northern Ireland. But what complicates things is that many of the people involved in Gaelic football here have complicated past themselves. What the Good Friday Agreement did, many Americans don't know that one of the repercussions of it is they let everybody out of, even if you killed someone, you were let out of prison on the Good Friday Agreement, and everything is forgiven, a little bit like South Africa, with one major exception, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there's no holding. Yeah, but what he did was really terrible. So there are people that murdered people were let out of prison. And for the most part, it's been a success. And it's not like they've gone back to. So, for example, I've met a man named Pat McGee, who's trying to learn the Irish fiddle, but he was the Brighton bomber. He tried to kill Maggie Thatcher with a bomb, and he put it in the Brighton Beach Hotel. It wound up killing other people and damaging. Did not get that. They narrowly missed her, but he's walking around. So for us, it's inconceivable that it happens once in a while, like because of people like John Conroy and what they're doing at Northwestern University with the Innocence Project. Is there are people that are getting out of prison that were falsely imprisoned. But what they did in Belfast was they let prisoners go free that had been convicted of murder. And there's some of these people that were involved in the violence are involved in Gaelic football now. And so for us, if you want to coach Little League baseball, there's a background check, right? We don't want anyone around our 10-year-olds that that got caught shoplifting a few years ago, or that kind of thing, and probably for good reason. But that we have to be careful about that. But in Ireland, there's a different mentality. And so you might remember when I was in Tralee in the Republic of Ireland, not in Northern Ireland, not in Belfast.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that in the beginning.
Yeah, but the lines are blurred to many people. But there was a man named Martin Ferris who I coached his son in a couple camps, and Martin Ferris had gone to prison for running guns. Running guns from Boston to get them to the IRA. He did a 10-year prison sentence, and when he came out, he got elected to the Senate, to their Senate.
He was a senator back when I came and visited you over there.
Yes, so in America, we would have a hard time imagining. Although Bobby Rush is a good example how occasionally it can happen. That Bobby Rush was involved with the Black Panthers, which was arguably quite a bit different than what Martin Ferris was doing. But occasionally, people can get themselves into trouble in America and come out and have a rebirth in politics. sometimes we don't want them to have a rebirth in politics, which I won't get into now. But in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, some of these people that were in prison with for Republican nationalism to try to unite Ireland are seen as heroes.
How is the book coming along? We
Well,
got 5 minutes. Let's focus on the book.
Well, I'm about 150 pages in, and I'm flirting with. I don't want to jinx it, but I'm flirting with a publisher now that I'm hoping will make an offer on it. One of the things I've struggled with is it a book for an American reader, or is it a book for an Irish and UK? You're more of a European reader, and I wonder. I think you're an unusual guy, Mike, in a lot of ways, but you understand Brexit, you understand the Troubles, you understand. Maybe you don't have a great understanding of Gaelic football, but the reader is going to have to get at least briefly, going to have to be briefed, summarize Gaelic football and Gaelic sports, summarize the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and summarize Brexit. Whereas I do think most Americans don't really have any kind of connection to Brexit. It doesn't really mean anything to them, but it was a huge deal here. Belfast voted against it, but of course it happened anyway. But the people who voted against it were the nationalists. And now it looks like there's a chance that Brexit will help fuel a united Ireland, maybe not this year, but over the next couple decades. There's a really great Chicago writer. You remember Alex Kotlowitz, that he wrote There Are No Children Here, which is it's like the textbook if you're trying to understand Chicago poverty and that kind of thing for sociology classes. And I know Kotlowitz, I don't know him well, but I know him a little bit. And his book, he had a book called American Summer about 4 or 5 years ago. It came out the same year my book on Sean Harrington came out. And but what he did in that book, it's a really brilliant book, but it's about 7 or 8 stories, and he braids those stories together, and they all would stand up as one single magazine piece in the New Yorker. And I think maybe one of them more, he writes for the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal. I write for the Heartland Journal, but which is arguably just as important. What Kotlowitz did in that book that was really brilliant is he braided several stories together into one larger narrative about gun violence in Chicago. It's a really terrific book. But if you go into it thinking who's the hero of this book, who am I rooting for? Like you root for Sean Harrington in my book. In his book, there is no one person to root for, but it gives you a great sort of a buffet, if you will, of what the violence in Chicago is like, and they're all so that's actually the model for this one. Is I'm going to try to braid these stories together into a larger narrative about refugees and forgiveness and how sports can often bring people together.
Well, this has been great. I'm going to ask you one last question regarding Gaelic football. Who was the guy who played for you on the Tralee Tigers, who was a short order cook and a plumber, who went on to be a really hotshot Gaelic football player? Do I have this right?
Yes, well, it's an important question. His name's Kieran Donaghy. And when I had Kieran Donaghy for Gaelic football, he's a wild kid that was drinking all night and that kind of thing. But after I left, and after my book, Paddy on the Hardwood, came out, he became the biggest sports star in all of Ireland. And I remember because of his success in Gaelic football. And his success in basketball helped, but he was unusual because he's a star in both sports. Maybe the best player in the country for a while and playing 2 sports, the best player in 2 sports at the same time. And I remember getting off the bus in Dublin, and a bus went by, and his picture was on it. And I thought he became
Not the one I took of him.
Yeah, but it was actually Kieran Donaghy who gave me the idea for this book a while back. Is he rang me about a kid in County Kerry named Stephen O'Cumber, who's playing Gaelic football. He says, you got to write about him. I said, why would I care about a guy named O'Cumber? I thought it was an Irish name. But no, it was a Nigerian name. And he was, African heritage. He was on the verge of becoming a Gaelic football star. And he was the one who first told me, hey, there's these immigrants coming over. This is your kind of story. And I had a complicated relationship with Gaelic football because my guys would have to miss practice to go to Gaelic football. But yes, it was Kieran Donaghy. And since then, Mike, you'll be interested to know, he's maybe like a Charles Barkley character to us. He's on television all the time. He's the color analyst at halftime for Sky Sports, and he's a huge name in all of Irish sports. But it's opened a lot of doors for me is when I meet these Gaelic football fellas who can be a little bit, closed off, especially in Belfast, where the motto might as well be "Say Nothing," is just they know about Kieran Donaghy, and they remember my affiliation and the affiliation with basketball. So Kieran Donaghy has continued to bless me, besides being a great Irish basketball player back then and the basketball hero of my book. His success has continued to open doors for me.
Well, that's great. And without you, he probably wouldn't have had that all happen to him. So you're the key guy here. And we want to thank you for joining us for Live from the Heartland for the week of July 7th. It's great to talk to you on the 4th of July. We're going to have a cookout in the backyard. I'll be talking about this interview with them. We're going to share it with people. It'll be up on Friday. And you give my love to both Connie and Alma. And how about I get you to commit to coming on the show again in another few weeks?
That'd be great. Good. And I do remember, Mike, last year we landed from Belfast on the 4th of July, and I turned on the Chicago Sun-Times app on my phone, and I said to Connie, turn the plane around. Let's just go home. It was that terrible incident in Highland Park. So let's hope it's a more peaceful day in Chicago today.
Well, we're hoping. You're a hell of a guy, Russ, and I'm glad you're my friend.
Thank you. I feel the same way.